If you would, in your Bibles, turn to Amos chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. And as you're turning there, let me remind you one more time that we're in the second section of the book, which is the pronouncement of judgment upon the 8 different nations. 6 of those nations are heathen nations, or what we would call Gentile nations. The other 2 nations are Judah and Israel. Now in chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, Amos pronounced judgment upon Judah. And of course, Judah was the name of the southern kingdom during the divided monarchy period. In other words, after Solomon died, the kingdom of Israel split into 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom, which became known as Israel, and the southern kingdom, which became known as Judah. Israel was made up of the 10 northern tribes, and Judah was made up of the 2 southern tribes. I won't name all the 10 tribes. You can actually come in and deduce that. Let me just tell you the 2 southern tribes that Judah was made up of. Judah, of course, and Benjamin. But there were many families from the various northern tribes that moved to the southern kingdom after the kingdom split, because they didn't agree with Jeroboam's decision to create a new religion, their own religion. If you remember, Jeroboam made 2 golden calves. He placed one in Bethel and he placed the other in Dan, and he ordained priests who weren't Levites to be able to minister at these places of worship. Look at 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 28 through 31. It says, after seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it's too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Now remember, God had specifically told Israel that when they came to the promised land, he would choose one place for them to come to. And where was that one place? Jerusalem. He said, it's too much trouble to go to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, and notice it's a little g, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. Now, the sin that Jeroboam was guilty of was something called syncretism. How many of you ever heard the term syncretism? Well, if you ever get a degree in theology or biblical literature or divinity or anything like that, you will hear this term all the time. And what syncretism is when you take your religion and you combine it with other religions. Well, that's what Jeroboam did. He didn't want to just create his own out of the air. No, they had a rich history. So what he wanted to be able to do is he wanted to take the religion of the Israelites, and then he wanted to combine it with some aspects of the other pagan religions and boil it into one religion. And so what he did is the very same thing that Aaron did, except he made 2 calves. He came out and he said, you all know our history. We as a family went down to Egypt. A Pharaoh rose up who knew not Joseph, and as a result of that, he enslaved our people, but God rescued us, and God brought us out of the land of Egypt. And then he said, these are the gods that have brought you out of Egypt, violating the 2nd commandment. He made idols. So let's keep reading. One he set up in Bethel, the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far as Dan to worship the other. Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. Now people, you remember this was a big deal, because even among the Levites, you had to be of the family, the clan of Aaron, to be able to minister inside the temple. You couldn't even just be a Levite. The Levites had different jobs depending upon what your clan was. If you remember Korah's rebellion, Korah was upset because he was of the tribe of Levi. Why can't he minister at the temple and burn incense and do those things? And what did God do? We talked about cremation last time. He sent fire and boom, wiped them out. It was a consuming fire. He cremated them there on earth to show that they were not only judged on in this life, on this earth, but they were also going to be judged in the life to come. So, he actually put in priests that weren't Levites. Now, not everyone in the northern kingdom agreed with this. So you had a few from each of the 10 tribes who moved to the southern kingdom because they couldn't put up with it. You'll always have a remnant that says, this is wrong. It might look like, and you've got to remember, we're living in the church period known as the church of the Laodiceans. It's the apostate church. And it might look like the church has lost its way. It might look like there's no one that's teaching the truth, but I promise you there's still a remnant out there that believes in God and is going to stick up for what is right. And that happened even then. When the kingdom split, you had families from each of the 10 northern tribes that said this isn't right, and they moved down to the southern kingdom. Now, the reason the southern kingdom was called Judah was because the tribe of Judah was the predominant tribe in the south. Plus, The kings came from that tribe. Turn to Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. It says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. Now, everyone knows what a scepter is, right? A scepter is a symbol of royal or imperial power. It's what a king holds. If you're holding the scepter, it means you have the royal power. You're the one in charge. You are the king. So it says the scepter will not depart from Judah, telling us that the one who's going to hold the royal power, the one who's going to have the imperial power, is coming from the tribe of Judah. Then it goes further. Nor the ruler's staff from his descendants. So they have to be from the tribe of Judah until the coming of the one to whom it belongs, the one to whom all nations will honor. And who is that? The Messiah, Jesus Christ. If you remember, he is from the tribe of Judah. That's why he's referred to as the Lion of Judah. It's because he's from the tribe of Judah. All of this is setting up for Jesus. And when Jesus comes, he will be the eternal king. Now look at 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. The oldest son of Israel was Reuben. But since he dishonored his father by sleeping with one of his father's concubines, his birthright was given to the sons of his brother Joseph. For this reason, Reuben is not listed in the genealogical records as the firstborn son. The descendants of Judah became the most powerful tribe, and they provided a ruler, in other words, a king, for the nation. They're supposed to come from them. But the birthright belonged to Joseph. Now, if you went through the book of Genesis with me, you understand what the coat of many colors was all about. When he received the coat of many colors, it wasn't just because, oh, he's my favorite, I love Joseph more than everyone else. No, that signified that he was going to receive the birthright. Now, of course, he had a younger brother that comes along later, which is Benjamin, but he was the youngest. But he receives it. That also explains why he went to check on his brothers, and he would report back to his father on what he saw. It's because he received, or was going to receive, the birthright. But that's also why his brothers hated him and sold him into slavery. But we all know the story. When he goes down to Egypt, because God's hand's upon him, because he serves God, he's faithful, he was the right choice to have the birthright. Well, he rises up in the ranks. And then, because of famine, the whole family has to go down to Egypt. And then they discover that this is Joseph, their brother, and he still has the birthright. Now, what does the birthright give you? The birthright gives you two things. Number one, it gives you a double portion. If you have 12 sons, you divide it 13 ways. 11 of the sons get one portion, but the birthright, the person who has it, gets a double portion. My dad had 4 sons. If Erdell is the oldest and he was worthy of the birthright, he would receive a double portion. It would be divided 5 ways. He would get 2/5, the rest of us would get 1/5. But here's what's interesting. Carol would be his responsibility. And the reason you get a double portion is because now you're responsible for all the women. You're responsible for the widows, the single women, for the needy. It's your job to do that. Well, if it's your job and you have that responsibility, you should also have the benefit. And that's why they received a double portion. Does that make sense? Now, when it came time to divide the tribes, because Joseph has the birthright, he's not going to receive his portion, but he gets 2 portions. And guess what? He has 2 sons. So he says, I don't want to receive a double portion. I want each of my sons to receive a portion. So he brings them to Jacob, and Jacob's going to bless them. Manasseh's the oldest, Ephraim's the youngest. Jacob does something kind of weird. He can't hardly see very well, but he crosses his hands. He puts his right hand on Ephraim, which is the dominant hand. That's where the one who's getting the blessing is supposed to go on. And he puts his left hand on the oldest, which is Manasseh. Joseph thinks he's making a mistake. He thinks, oh, bless his heart, he can't see. He's got the kids mixed up. So he tries to switch it. And what happens? Jacob says, leave me alone, I know what I'm doing. Ephraim will receive the birthright. Now that's why when the kingdom splits, the northern tribe is referred to Israel, but sometimes it's referred to as Ephraim. Why? Because it has the birthright. It's supposed to be the leader of those tribes. But that's also why you always had conflict between the tribe of Judah, because the kings come from that, and the tribe of Ephraim, because they had the birthright, and they're supposed to be a leader also. Does that make sense? So, The reason that the southern kingdom was called Judah was because the tribe of Judah was the predominant tribe in the south, plus the kings came from that tribe. So when Amos pronounced judgment on Judah, he was pronouncing it upon the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, because that's the name of the kingdom. He wasn't pronouncing it just on the tribe. It was on the southern kingdom. So let's read verse number 4 in Amos chapter 2. Thus saith the Lord. Here the word Lord is in all caps. That's Yahweh. It's the redeeming, covenant-keeping name of God. Only those who are in covenant with him can use that name. So thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have despised the law of the Lord, and have not kept his commandments, and their lies caused them to err after the which their fathers have walked. Now, once again, Amos begins the pronouncement of judgment with this common Hebraism for 3 transgressions and for 4. And by now you should know what it means. In fact, we ought to give a test next Wednesday night. We're not going to. Relax. But if we did, I would say, what does this common Hebraism mean? And you should be able to say that Judah was guilty of multiple sins, and these sins had filled the cup of God's wrath up to the brim. But this last sin has caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow, and now his judgment cannot be stopped. So what was the 4th sin that caused the cup of God's wrath to overflow? Well, according to Amos, they despised the law of the Lord, and as a result, they didn't keep his commandments. Now, this is interesting, because Amos pronounced judgment on 6 Gentile nations for committing crimes against humanity. In other words, the Gentiles had sinned against the natural law of God, whereas Judah had sinned against the written law of God. Now, does everyone know the difference between the natural law of God and the written law of God? Well, if you don't, let me explain the difference. The natural law of God is the standard of morality that's known and recognized by all men intuitively. In other words, God has implanted within each person a recognition of certain moral principles or ideals. As an example, in every culture, murder is always known to be or recognized to be wrong. Now, how they classify murder, depending upon the culture, may differ. In other words, in one culture, killing an enemy might not be seen as murder, but as self-defense. But in every culture, man recognizes and acknowledges that murder is wrong. That's what we mean by natural law. Now, the concept of natural law is biblical. Turn to Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. In fact, if you have your Bibles, when you turn here, you should put a little parenthesis in the margin and put the natural law. All right? Natural law of God. Notice what it says. Even Gentiles, even pagans, even heathens who do not have God's written law show that they know his law when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts, for their own conscience and thoughts either accuse them or tell them they're doing right. Do you see this? The Gentiles didn't have the written law, but they knew God's law instinctively. It was written in their heart, and their conscience either accused them of doing wrong or it affirmed that they were doing what was right. People, that's what we mean by natural law. If I go to China, I don't have to say, I need to look at your law book to find out if stealing is wrong. I can guarantee you that if I go to China and I take something that doesn't belong to me but belongs to someone else, they're going to arrest me for stealing, and I'm going to go, well, I didn't know stealing was wrong in China. If I go to Japan, I can guarantee you stealing is wrong there. If I go to Brazil, I can guarantee you stealing is wrong. Why? Because there's this natural law that God has written on our hearts. We just know taking something that doesn't belong to us is wrong. Right? That's what natural law means. So the 6 Gentile nations that Amos had pronounced judgment on were guilty of committing sins against the natural law of God. Aram was guilty of committing war crimes. They tortured their prisoners, if you remember. They took a threshing sledge that had iron teeth, and they laid their prisoners down, and they rode this over them. Philistia was guilty of human trafficking. Phoenicia was guilty of making money off of human trafficking. They didn't actually take the slaves. Hey, they were just the middleman. It's not really my fault who sells who or what. I'm just making money off of it. Edom was guilty of betraying his brother and harboring an eternal hatred towards him. and actually coming in and killing them, and they were just cruel when it came towards Israel. Ammon was guilty of infanticide. They were literally cutting babies out of their mother's womb. Moab was guilty of desecrating the dead. Now, all of these sins are crimes against humanity, but they're also sins against the natural law of God. In other words, they knew what they were doing was wrong, and no one had to tell them it was wrong. They instinctively knew that it was wrong, yet they still did it. And for that, God was going to punish them, and he did. Now, the written law of God refers to the divine revelation that was revealed through God's holy prophets and recorded for posterity. In Amos' day, it referred to the Pentateuch. In other words, the first 5 books of Moses, because that's all they had at that time. You got to remember, Amos is one of the first prophets. And he's one of the first recorded prophets, so these haven't yet been fulfilled. These prophecies are taken to the temple in Jerusalem. They're held there. If they don't come to pass, they're burned. But if they're kept there and they come to pass and they realize this man was a man of God, these prophetical writings are added. But he's one of the first prophets. So all they have is the first 5 books of Moses and possibly Job. Now, of course, God held Judah and Israel to a higher standard than he did the Gentile nations, because they had received the written law of God. But they also had a covenant relationship with God. So God expected more from them than he did the Gentile nations. That's why the Gentile nations were being punished. They had committed crimes against humanity. They had committed human atrocities, acts of cruelty, violations of the natural law of God that everyone knows is wrong. Whereas Judah and Israel, they were being punished for breaking the commandments of God. They had committed religious violations, or what we would call sins against God. So you have human atrocities versus religious violations. And from a human perception or perspective, one seems so much worse than the other, doesn't it? But in God's eyes, to whom much is given, much is required. And since Judah and Israel had received divine revelation, and they knew what God expected of them, they were held to a higher standard. Does everyone understand that? So even though their sins don't seem to be as bad as the Gentile nations, God is holding them to a higher standard. Now, the question you should be asking is what? What is the question you should be asking? Does God hold America to a higher standard? And if so, why? Are we set up on Judeo-Christian values? Are we set up on biblical principles? Do we have the written Word of God? And did we receive it as such? So does God hold America to a higher standard than he does, say, Russia, China, the Islamic nations? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Look back at verse 4. And let's see exactly what they were guilty of. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4 I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have despised the law of the Lord. Now I want you to underline the word despised. Despised is translated from the Hebrew word ma'as, and it means to detest, to abhor, to loathe, to disdain, to hate, to look down your nose at. And I could have kept on going, but you understand what it means. So what this is saying is that Judah detested, abhorred, and loathed the law of the Lord. They looked down their nose at it. Now, does everyone know what that idiom means? We say it all the time. Well, they just looked down their nose at it. Well, it means that they didn't consider the law of the Lord to be important or to have any value. And this is where America is today. We don't consider the Bible or its commands to be important or of any value to us. In fact, those on the left actually detest and abhor it. They hate it because it specifically states what is right and what is wrong. And it sets a clear standard of morality. Fornication and all types of sexual sin is wrong. It doesn't matter what society says. It doesn't matter if it says after 3 dates, well, you know, sex is just kind of expected. It doesn't matter if you say, well, our society says if you love that person, it's okay. No, the Bible says all sexual sin outside of marriage is wrong. Abortion is wrong. People, according to the Bible, abortion is not a choice. Abortion is wrong. It's murder. Same-sex marriage is wrong. It's not an acceptable alternative lifestyle. According to the Bible, it is an unacceptable alternative lifestyle. Transgenderism is wrong. Marijuana and all forms of mind-altering drugs are wrong. It's referred to in the New Testament as pharmakia. Our word pharmacy comes from that. We translate it as witchcraft, but most people don't even know what that means. What it means is these pagan priests would take these mind-altering drugs and they would have these revelations or visions in the spirit world. They saw things that regular people didn't. People, divorce is wrong, except in cases where the covenant is broken. And abuse is one of those things that makes it acceptable because of abuse. And I've taught on that before. Pornography is wrong, people. Doesn't matter what our society says. The Bible says it's wrong. And the list can go on and on. Now, most Americans feel that each individual should decide for themselves whether things are wrong or not. Because man is the measure of all things, not God. In fact, Protagoras is the one who said that. Anyone familiar with philosophy? He was one of the ancient Greek philosophers. If you studied philosophy, I really enjoyed philosophy. I was one of the weird ones. And so I would take those classes and I would go into this. And Protagoras is the one who said that. He said, man is the measure of all things. Now, does everyone know what that means? Well, what he meant by that is that each man must decide for himself what's right or wrong, good or bad, and not God or some type of unchanging moral law such as the Bible. You don't look at that. Man is the measure of all things. And more specifically, each individual is the measure of all things. You determine if it's right for you. And people, that's where America is today. Hey, if same-sex marriage works for you, that's fine. It's up to you. If you want to smoke pot, hey, it's your business. Smoke pot, it's okay. If you want to watch pornography, that's up to you. Who is God to tell you that it's wrong? And what's the Bible? Man, that Bible doesn't have the right to tell you what's wrong. You have to decide for yourself. And to have a Bible that claims to be the final authority on what's right and what's wrong, well, that's unacceptable to the left, to liberals. They believe that man has to decide for himself what's right and what's wrong. And what's sad is that has permeated inside the church today. And many of you believe that. Wake up, Judah. That's exactly what Amos meant when he said, despising the law of the Lord. They detested, abhorred, and loathed. They disdained, they hated, and they looked down their nose at the law of the Lord, which was their Bible at the time. It was the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. Now, once you get to that place as a society where you look down your nose at the Bible, then society as a whole stops keeping God's commandments. Look back at verse 4 again in Amos chapter 2. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have despised the law of the Lord, and have not kept his commandments. Do you see that? Once their society got to the point that they despised the law of the Lord, they stopped keeping God's commandments. In other words, once they got to the point where they thought that it was up to them to decide what's right and what's wrong, they stopped keeping God's commandments. Everyone did what was right in their eyes. Once we got to the point where we started looking down our nose at the Bible, then we stopped keeping God's commandments. People, there was a time, even if you weren't a believer, that you looked at the Bible and you said, that's a holy book. You might not believe the Bible. You might not even be a Christian. But you looked at that and you go, you know what? I'm not even a Christian, but that's God's book. You went to the legal system. You placed your hand on the Bible. You raised your right hand. And you solemnly swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help you God. But now we don't do that. We solemnly swear to tell the truth, but we don't do that. And people, this is where America is today. And that's why there has been 58 million abortions since Roe v. Wade. That's why the porn industry generates about $13 billion alone in America. Just in America. That's why recreational marijuana is legal in the District of Columbia, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, in Alaska. That's not medical marijuana, people. That's recreational marijuana. And this November, when we go to vote for a president, Arizona, California, Maine, Massachusetts, and Nevada are voting on whether or not to legalize recreational marijuana. And it's leading in all the polls. California's going to pass it. Now, it's still against federal law. But we have a president that refuses to do his main responsibility. A president only has 3 main responsibilities according to the Constitution. And the very first responsibility the president has is to keep or to uphold the laws of the land, and he refuses to do that. So you've got states that are passing laws that are against what the federal law says. But the reason all of this is happening, people, is because America despises the Bible. And as a result, we no longer keep God's commandments. Now look back at verse number 4, chapter 2 in Amos. Notice what it says. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have despised the law of the Lord, the written law, the Bible. And as a result have not kept his commandments, and their lies is the root cause. Their lies caused them to err. Now whose lies caused them to err? The false prophets and their leaders. You see, it was their false prophets and their leaders that condoned their actions. It was their false leaders and their false prophets and their leaders that led them astray and told them that it was okay to adopt the laws and principles from the neighboring pagan nations. It was their false prophets and their leaders that told them it was okay to adopt the practices of their neighbors, because their practices were more progressive and much less restrictive. And that's what led them to despise the law of the Lord. They looked at what the law of the Lord said, and the law of the Lord said, this is right, this is wrong. This is right, this is wrong. This is right, this is wrong. They looked at the pagan nations and they said, well, my neighbors, they get to decide. It's not right over there and it's not wrong over there. So they looked at that, and before long, they're despising the law of the Lord. Wow. But they knew better, because their fathers had walked in the commandments of the Lord. Now here's what's interesting. Whenever the fathers are brought up in the Bible, it can be used either positively or negatively, and we do the same thing. When we talk about our fathers, we can either be talking about our physical fathers, our grandparents, those on back, or we can be talking about our forefathers in America. We can be talking about George Washington. We can be talking about Thomas Jefferson. We can be talking about Samuel Adams and Ben Franklin and those, right? If we do it in a positive light, we're talking about the fathers of our nation. If we do it in a negative light, we're talking about our physical fathers and what they did, and it's in a negative light. Now here's what's interesting. It said they knew better because their fathers had walked in the commandments of the Lord. Their fathers respected the laws of the Lord. Now that was their forefathers. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua. And so when he says your fathers have walked in that, they respected what God said. Our founding fathers respected the Bible. We were based on biblical principles and Christian values. Now, if we want to look at this in negative side, we can look at fathers in a negative way and say their fathers did the very same thing. Even though their forefathers did this, they looked around and they didn't want commandments that told them this is right and this is wrong, this is right and this is wrong. They wanted to be the measure of all things. They wanted to determine whether it was right or not. Now, I'm using this in a positive sense because I believe that's what Amos was doing. He said their fathers respected the law of the Lord. They didn't buy into the lies of the false prophets and the wicked leaders. Instead, they remained faithful to God. So people, Judah had no excuse. They had the law of the Lord, the written law. They had their fathers as an example, and yet they were still led astray, which caused them to despise the Bible, which led them to not keeping God's commandments. And for that reason, God's judgment would not be overturned. It's coming. Now, let's look at what type of judgment was pronounced upon them. Look at verse 5. But I will send a fire upon Judah. There's that fire. We talked about it last week with cremation. Fire always symbolizes what? The judgment of God, destruction. And I will send a fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, referring to the king's palaces, but also to the temple. And of course, it was fulfilled in 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar not only destroyed Jerusalem, but he also destroyed the temple, and he took almost all of the inhabitants of the southern kingdom into captivity with the exception of the poorest of the poor. Literally wiped them out. Why? Because it started by despising the law of the Lord, which caused them to not keep the law of the Lord. And as a result of that, judgment came.